Hey folks, people who believe in socialism need to stop using the phrase redistribution of wealth. Redistribution of wealth really has nothing to do with socialism. Every government in the world, every economic system redistributes wealth to some degree or other. For example, I'm walking right now on sidewalks. These sidewalks were built by wealth that was redistributed from taxpayers like me to the public in order to build sidewalks, right? I mean, we have food stamps. The income of taxpayers is used to give food stamps. That provides for low-income families to buy food. It also subsidizes the food manufacturers and the food companies and agribusiness. So, that's one thing. I mean, there's corporate subsidies, there's welfare programs. Every government in the world, to some degree or other, redistributes wealth. That's not the difference between capitalism and socialism. That's just something governments do. Sometimes they do it a lot, sometimes they do it a little. Sometimes they redistribute to the top, to the rich. Sometimes they redistribute to low-income folks. But redistribution of wealth goes on to some degree or other in every economic system. That's not the difference between capitalism and socialism. The redistribution of wealth is just kind of the natural activity of government. Socialism is when the mechanisms for creating wealth, the major means of production, industries, oil wells, big manufacturing entities, factories, banking, when these things are placed under public control or subject to public control and therefore unleashed to perform better and create a greater level of abundance and wealth. If all the Bolsheviks had done in 1917 was redistribute the wealth that already existed in Russia, Russia and the Soviet Union would never become the world's biggest producer of steel. They would have never beat Hitler. They would have never been able to enter outer space. What socialism did was take control of the mechanisms for creating wealth and subject them to a central plan or a 5-year plan dictating economic activity, regulating what went on, and as a result, they created, and Russia and the USSR became a superpower. China right now. In China, if all they had done is when the communists came to power in 1949, they had just redistributed wealth that already existed, China would still be a deeply, deeply poor country. There wasn't that much wealth there to begin with. What happened was that at first they built up some government-controlled industries. They built a steel industry with Soviet assistance. They started making their own tractors and other things. Eventually, they, in the 1970s, the late 70s, they started bringing in foreign investment. But they've publicly controlled and exercised state control over the entities that create wealth, over banking, over major industries, and over computer manufacturing, over their healthcare system, their education system. And as a result of utilizing state control and forcing the entities that create wealth to function in a rational manner and to be essentially controlled by the state and to work in the interests of society, by doing that, they have been able to make China the second largest economy in the world today, raise 700 million people out of poverty. Socialism isn't about redistributing wealth. It's about controlling the entities of wealth creation. And by the way, that doesn't even necessarily mean state ownership. In China, there's a lot of private corporations. But at the end of the day, the private corporations in China are forced to do what is in the interests of the company, or of the country. They're forced to do what is in the interests of the country. The difference between capitalism and socialism is that in capitalism, the major means of production, the banks, factories, industries, natural resources, all the centers of economic power function for the purpose of making profits for their owners. The people who own these entities operate them simply to make profits for themselves. And as a result, you get lots of poverty, you get lots of irrationality, you get lots of suffering because there's no rational plan at the center of the economy. Socialism is not redistributing wealth, it's not jealousy, it's not raising the income tax on people that have lots of money. Socialism is taking control of the major centers of economic power and utilizing them to make society better as a whole, to raise the standard of living, to raise the level of development. And that has been successful. That's how China went from being one of the poorest countries in the world to being, at this point, the second largest economy in the world. That's how Russia went from being, an agrarian, backward, feudal country to being the country that beat Hitler, the country that conquered outer space, the country that vastly had a huge rise in its standard of living. It did it by taking control of the methods and the instruments that create wealth, the means of production. Capitalism is irrational. People think that socialism is about jealousy. But when it gets down to it, the problem with capitalism isn't that it's not fair. The problem with capitalism is that it's not rational. Under capitalism, the more efficient the means of production become, the more technology advances, the result becomes greater poverty. Take Uber, for example. That's a great leap in technology. In a rational society, the fact that we can now call, cars, vehicles for hire on our phones, that would be a good thing. But as a result, the wages of drivers have vastly decreased. Under capitalism, advances in technology lead to greater poverty, they lead to greater suffering, they lead to a greater abundance of goods, and you get people suffering in mass amid a great abundance. The Great Depression was largely caused, and one of the greatest ironies of it was the fact that it was a depression where people were hungry because there were too many houses. People were homeless because there were too many houses. People were hungry because there was too much food. That's the irrationality of the capitalist system. And socialism puts rational human beings in control of economic entities and forces the economy to work in a rational way. And that's the difference. Socialism is central planning. Socialism is 5-year plans. Socialism is the economy being organized rationally in order to work in the interest of the country and society as a whole. And that's the difference between socialism and capitalism. So people need to lose this redistribution of wealth. You can talk about income inequality if you want, but that's not the essence of the problem. And people are not going to like socialism if they think it's about taking the wealth that they've worked very hard to earn and redistributing it. And that's why a lot of people throughout the United States are convinced that socialism is evil. They don't understand that socialism is about taking the oil wells and the steel mills and the banking industry and forcing it to work for the good of the country. In their mind, socialism is taking their money, making their taxes go up, taking their money and giving it to somebody who has less. And they feel like, oh, well, I worked hard. Why should my level of wealth be redistributed? They don't understand that socialism is about increasing abundance. I've had people say to me, socialists want everyone to be equally poor. I've had people say to me before many times, people have said things to the effect of, that place, that hotel you're staying in, that's too fancy. You can't live there because you're a socialist. No, socialists want to raise the level of material abundance. In fact, the Communist Party, they used to have a saying, they said, nothing is too good for the working class. They want people to raise their material conditions and raise their standards of living. So there's just a lot of confusion. Socialism is about controlling the means of production and the mechanisms that create wealth and utilizing them to build a better country and a better world for the people.